Hello, and welcome to SEDE 7335, Literature for Adolescents. I want to talk a little bit in this video about evaluating the problem novel, which shows up generally as realistic fiction, and also gender representation in young adult literature. So when we think about young adult literature and what is called the problem novel in the past versus now, we see some changes. So in terms of characters, in the past, the characters in YA literature tended to live in idyllic, pleasant suburban homes. Now, what we see in adolescent literature is the characters live at a variety of social and economic levels, and some of them come from harsh, difficult places to live. In terms of language, in the past, we saw generally standard English in the YA literature. Now we see more colloquial language, and it includes the way people really talk. Sometimes that includes profanity as well as ungrammatical constructions, which as English teachers, that tends to bother us, but many times that's the language that adolescent readers relate to. When we talk about evaluating realistic fiction or the problem novel, we want to make sure that there's a strong, interesting, believable plot that centers around a problem that a young person might really have in today's world. The story should have the power to transport the reader into another person's thoughts and feelings, and there should be rich characterization, so a balance of good and negative qualities in the characters. We also want to make sure that the setting of these books enhances the story and is described in such a way that the reader gets the intended picture, that it paints a picture in the reader's mind. The book should have a worthwhile theme, so the reader should be left with something to think about. And there should also be a smoothness of style, so that there's a steady flow in the novel and it easily carries the reader along through the story. The book should have universal appeal so that it speaks to more than a single group of readers, and we're going to talk some more about that in just a little bit. It should be subtle enough so that it stimulates the reader to think about different aspects of the story. And it should have a way of dealing with the problems so that the reader is left with some insight into either how society deals with problems, how individuals deal with problems, and even how he or she can deal with problems. When we think about the problems that show up in adolescent literature or problem novels, realistic fiction, we want to look for problems that belong specifically to young adults in today's world. Many of these are different from what we used to see in adolescent literature, but they're generally going to be problems dealing with peer groups, with family relationships, with living in a multicultural world, or also with the physical body. And this harkens back to what we talked about with Havighurst and his developmental tasks for adolescents. A lot of times people tend to think that all the YA literature out there is depressing, that they're all downers, but there's plenty that are much more optimistic. Some quick examples that I included here: No More Dead Dogs by Gordon Korman and Son of the Mob, both by Gordon Korman. Those are really aimed at middle grade readers, middle school readers. He writes with a great, funny voice, fun to read. And then The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, that whole series by Anne Brashares, another series that is much more optimistic than some of what we see out there for adolescents. When we think about these optimistic titles, they tend to focus either on the romantic quest, on friendship and love, or on wish fulfillment. So there are optimistic books out there. There's a good balance of optimistic and not so optimistic books. It's just a matter of looking for them. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about gender and reading preferences. I want to give you some information out of the book Reading Don't Fix No Chevys by Michael Smith and Jeff Wilhelm. It was published in 2002, and they were specifically studying male high school readers. But here are some things that they found, some generalizations that they were able to make, and these are not unfamiliar to many of us. First, girls tend to comprehend fiction better than boys. But what we know, in fact, is that as human beings, we're hardwired for story. So even though girls tend to comprehend fiction better than boys, all of us learn via story. They found that boys seemed to prefer nonfiction, magazines, and newspapers. They found that boys tend to prefer short texts or texts with short sections. They found that girls tend to enjoy leisure reading more than boys, and they found that many boys enjoy reading about sports and hobbies. Some additional findings that they wrote about: some boys enjoy fantasy and science fiction. That seems to be spreading to girls as well in the past number of years. They found that graphic novels and comic books are more popular with boys than girls. They found that boys prefer visual texts and that boys really do judge a book by its cover. So those are the findings they present in Reading Don't Fix No Chevys. Again, these are some generalizations, and I would argue that girls and boys can break through these generalizations based upon the amount that they read. So when we think about evaluating young adult literature for gender representations, we want to keep some questions in mind as we're thinking about the books that we're considering using in our classrooms or even including in our classroom library. So here's some questions that you want to ask about some of the books that you're reading. This information comes from a book called Young Adult Literature, Exploration, Evaluation, and Appreciation, written by Boucher and Hinton in 2010. That's the second edition. So here are the questions they recommend that you consider as you're reading these books. You want to look and see if the characters are developed as individuals, no matter what their gender or sexuality. And you're talking generally about the main characters, the protagonists. You want to ask yourself, do the descriptions, words, and actions of the character expand gender roles, or do they reflect traditional stereotypes? What you're looking for are those that expand gender roles. You want to ask yourself if the occupations, aspirations, and achievements are gender neutral. You want to consider whether or not males and females evidence as emotional as well as logical characteristics. You want to consider whether or not males and females confront others, interrupt, and initiate conversation. You want to consider whether or not females are trapped in passive and whiny roles. You want to ask, are the females competitive with a desire to meet high expectations? Do the illustrations depict gender stereotypes? Does the book include any reversals of traditional gender roles? And here are a few more. You also want to look for evidence of various family structures in that book. So single parent, two parent, same-sex parents, living with a grandparent. You want to look for lots of different family structures. You want to read and consider how males and females gain status. What improves their status? Is it being successful at sports or competition? Or is it being a good nurturer or being a good person? You want to think about how the author wants readers to view members of the genders. Think about the message that the author is sending. You want to think about what effect the author's gender has on the books as well. You want to think about whether or not the book is truthful and if it respects its readers. And you want to think about whether or not the book helps readers overcome their personal discomfort with sexual roles. So it's a lot to consider when you're examining books for gender considerations. So what I'd like for you to do is think back to some of the books that we've read for class and ask these different questions about gender considerations. And the next time that we meet together synchronously online, I'd like for us to discuss this a little bit. It's also good information for you to include as you're blogging about the books that you're reading. So think about these questions, and when you get ready to blog one of your next books, answer some of these questions within the text of that blog. Thanks for tuning in.